The first step is to download your pattern. Select your file according to your paper format and the size you wish to make. Print your pattern at 100% scale. There is a scale test included on the first page of your pattern to ensure you have printed correctly. Trim around the thin black border and use clear sticky tape to piece the pages together. There is a layout included in the instruction guide to help you lay out all the pages correctly. For this style, I've adhered a medium weight fusible interfacing to the main fabric. This will give structure to the garment and help hold its shape. If your fabric is particularly heavyweight, you may not need this, but in most cases, it is advisable to use it. Trim around each individual pattern piece and lay the pattern onto the fabric. You can follow the cutting layout included in the instructions to make the most economical use of your fabric. Cut according to the individual instructions marked on each of the pieces. Open out the centre front bodice piece so that the right side is facing towards you. Place the side front bodice piece on top of the centre front bodice piece along the seam, matching up the adjoining notches. The right sides should be touching one another. Pin in place. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and then repeat for the other side. Next, place a side back bodice piece on top of the centre back bodice piece, matching the adjoining notches. Pin in place. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other side so that you have a pair of back pieces. Place the back pieces on top of the front pieces, matching along the side seams. The right sides should be touching one another. Pin in place. Stitch along both of the side seams using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, cut your trim piece into 4 equal pieces. Pin 2 of the pieces to the front piece at the pointed part of the neckline. Tack the trim piece in place at the seam allowance to secure it in place. Just as we have done for the main pieces, repeat for the bodice lining pieces so that all the bodice lining pieces are stitched in place. Stitch using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once your lining is stitched together, cut a piece of 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch rigoline or sew-in boning for the front and back panel seams and the side seams. The boning should be 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch shorter than the top and bottom edge so that it does not interfere with the neckline or waist seam later. Using the sewing machine, secure the boning in place to each of the seam allowances. I've attached all of my boning to my lining pieces, however you can also attach it to the main pieces if this is what you prefer, it's up to you. Place the lining piece on top of the main piece with the right sides together, ensuring the trim pieces are kept out of the way. Pin all the way along the neckline edge. Stitch along the neckline edge using a 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Using a small pair of scissors or small clippers, clip into the curved edges of the neckline. Take care not to accidentally snip into the stitch line, just clip into the seam allowance. This will help the neckline sit nice and flat in the next step. Turn the garment through to the right side along the neckline edge. Use the iron to press well along the neckline edge so that it is nice and flat. Once this is done, set aside the bodice for now. Now we will start working on the skirt. Place the side skirt piece on top of the centre front skirt piece, with the right sides together. Pin in place along the seam. Stitch along the seam using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Overlock this seam and then repeat for the other side. Place the centre back skirt piece on top of the side skirt piece with the right sides together. Pin in place. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Overlock this seam and then repeat for the other side. Using the longest stitch length on the sewing machine, stitch along the top edge of all of the skirt pieces. Don't back tack on either end so the threads can be pulled to gather down the piece. Pull on the threads to gather down the skirt piece. The skirt must be small enough to fit on the bottom edge of the bodice. Once it is small enough and the gathers are evenly distributed, tie off the threads to secure the gathers in place. The seams on the front and back will align with the bodice seams. There are no side seams on the skirt. A notch on the skirt will align with the side seams of the bodice. Pin the skirt piece to the lower edge of the bodice with the right sides touching one another. The main bodice layer, lining bodice layer, and skirt piece will all be pinned together at the seam. Repeat the skirt steps for the tulle pieces if you'd like to add tulle to your garment. This is optional. Attach the tulle at the waist in the same way we attach the main pieces. The tulle is a little shorter and will sit behind the main skirt on the inside of the garment. I've not added tulle to my garment as my fabric already has quite a nice amount of structure to it. Stitch along the seam using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have reached the centre front point, ensure your needle is down and then pivot at the point to continue sewing the rest of the seam. This will ensure your centre front point is nice and sharp. Next, overlock this seam, overlocking along the seam allowance waist seam. Next, press the seam allowance upwards towards the bodice and then top stitch along the seam 3 mm or 1/8 of an inch from the edge on the bodice side. Overlock each of the centre back edges separately. Catch the lining and the main layer together as you overlock. Now it's time to install the invisible zipper in the centre back edge. Open out the zipper and pin each side of the zipper tape to the centre back edge. A 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance has been given at the centre back edge to install the zipper. Change the machine foot to the invisible zipper foot and stitch along the zipper tape as close to the zipper teeth as possible. Once both sides of the zipper are secured in place, close the zipper. Pin the seam allowance below the base of the zipper closed. Stitch from the stitching at the base of the zipper all the way through to the hem of the skirt using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Fold the top edge of the zipper tape behind the seam allowance on each side. Secure with a pin. Then, using a hand sewing needle to secure the top edge of the zipper neatly in place on each side. Fold the hem under by 5 cm or 2 inches. Press well with the iron and then repeat this step again to secure the raw edge of the hem. Pin in place. Top stitch along the hem edge to secure it in place. Once you've finished that, you're all done.